you think you have the right to an attorney, but do you? So I want you to picture this. You're in a courtroom, alone, and it smells like coffee and anxiety, and the benches in the courtroom, they're packed. It's mostly women, it's mostly people of color, and they're mostly holding scraps of legal papers. And the courtroom is loud. It's not what you'd expect. There's babies crying, there's people screaming at each other, and then to your right, there's a lawyer. It's your opponent's lawyer. It's someone who does this for a living. Now you just got handed a stack of legal papers filled with jargon that you can't understand. And you try to flip through the pages, you're making sense of what's in front of you. There's deadlines that have passed that you didn't even know existed. And there's a list of every payment of rent that you've made to your landlord since you started renting out that apartment. I mean, you can barely remember what you had for dinner last night. How are you supposed to know if everything you're saying is correct? And then the judge looks at you and they say, are you ready to proceed? You know, what do you think happens next? Most of the time, the answer is simple. You lose. But it's not because you're wrong. And it's not even because the other side is right. But it's because they have a lawyer and you don't. Now, unfortunately, in this country, this actually isn't a rare scenario, right? If we take a look at housing cases, for example, which is a sector of civil court cases, while 90% of landlords have lawyers, while only 10% of tenants do. And if you're a part of the overwhelming majority of tenants that appear in court without legal representation, then you're likely to lose up to 75% of the time. Now, so much of what we think we know about the legal profession comes from our favorite crime dramas. These are the shows that I loved growing up. I loved Law and Order, and I loved How to Get Away with Murder. And most of the country thinks the same way. In fact, 50% of the Americans wrongly believe that if you're too poor to afford a lawyer in civil court, that one will be appointed to you. And that's the case in criminal court. If you don't have the money for an attorney, one will be appointed to you. That is a constitutional right that was cemented by a Supreme Court case called Gideon v. Wainwright, which was decided in 1963. And it said that when something as precious as your freedom is at stake, then you should have a lawyer regardless of your income level. But when you step into a civil courtroom, everything changes. These are your constitutional rights to legal representation in the civil courtroom. If you see nothing on the screen, that's not because I forgot a slide, it's because there is no constitutional right to civil legal representation. That's cases that involve your housing, your family, your security. The impacts are devastating for millions of poor people in this country. And that's because of yet another Supreme Court case. It's called Lassiter versus Social Services, and it was decided in 1981. And it involved a black mother in North Carolina who was fighting for the custody of her child. And in that case, unlike in Gideon, they said that, well, losing your child forever, it just wasn't severe enough for us to require that you have an attorney. And now, flash forward 40 years into the future, and your chances of getting a legal aid lawyer are still just as slim. And that's despite the legal profession growing exponentially. As you see on the screen, there's over 1.3 million lawyers in this country. A recent article said that in 2025, the number of people applying to law school increased by 20%. I look at my Yale classmates and I think to myself, everyone at Yale wants to be a lawyer. But the problem is that only 10,000 of them are in legal aid. And so if you're in a state like Colorado or New Mexico, there might only be 2 lawyers for every 10,000 people who are living in poverty. And that's like having a lifeguard for an entire ocean. And for organizations like the Legal Services Corporation, which is the largest provider of legal services in the country, well, they'll receive about 2 million requests for help every single year. Well, they'll have to turn away half of those requests because they lack the funding or the staffing or the resources. This isn't an accident. It's a policy choice. And it's one that leaves millions of people to does it actually mean to have to face the system alone? Because it's not just about not having a lawyer. It's about the fact that seemingly every part of the process is stacked against you. And today, I want to talk about housing court because that's the area that I know best. But I want you to remember that this only represents a portion of the millions of civil legal problems that people face every single year. And the process starts before you even step into a courtroom. In New York City, for example, if you're in housing court and a landlord is trying to evict you as a tenant, well, they're supposed to follow a particular process. It starts with something basic but crucial, right? They have to serve you legal papers so that you know that there's a case against you. So usually a process server or some kind of third party, they are supposed to hand you those papers directly or in some other kind of legally approved way. Now it seems simple, but it actually doesn't always happen this way. In fact, there's actually a name that lawyers use to describe consistently bad service. It's what lawyers call sewer service. It's the idea that instead of handing you those papers the way they're supposed to, they actually just toss them, sometimes literally into the sewer. Or, again, instead of handing it to you, they might just tape it on your door. Or they might give it to your child. And maybe you never see those papers. But the problem is, they are how you know that you even have a court date. They tell you where to go, when to show up, how to respond. And if you never get them, then you miss all of that. And the court process, it doesn't just stop because you weren't informed. And now you're already behind in a game that you didn't even know you were playing. But let's say that you do find out about your court date. Well, what happens next? You have to find a way to get there. And actually, a 2023 study found that longer trips to court can actually cause evictions. They can cause you to lose in civil court. A 15-year sample of Philadelphia eviction outcomes found that tenants who have to travel really far distances to get to court are more likely to fail to appear and to respond to their evictions. Now, what do you think happens if you don't appear in court? You lose by default. And so, yeah, losing in civil court can also depend on whether the train was late, or if you live really far from the courthouse. And if you're working, well, you'll probably have to take off work too. And maybe that work is going to be unpaid, especially if you're an hourly wage worker. And maybe that means risking losing your job altogether because your boss doesn't want you to keep taking time off of work for you to go to court. And this has extreme consequences for people because there's a paradox that's built into this. Because if you're in housing court because you're behind on your rent, or if you're in another civil court because maybe a debt collector is coming after you, well, that's probably because you don't have the money to pay them right now. Or maybe you need a little bit more time to get it. But now that same system is asking you to do something that makes it even harder. They're asking you to come to court unpaid for you to fight to keep your housing, to keep your wages, to fight for just a little bit more time. I mean, how does this make sense? It furthers cycles of debt and poverty and instability. And if you're a parent, it's likely that you're going to have to find childcare. It's the case that regardless of income level, more than 80% of households with children have at least one civil legal problem every single year. Nearly half of low-income households with children experience at least one problem specifically related to family matters or personal safety. When I was in housing court, I saw this firsthand. I saw babies in strollers, I saw toddlers sitting on laps, and I saw school-aged children who, instead of being able to attend classes, were sitting on these hard wooden benches for hours. Civil legal problems, they affect households. For families with children, they can affect a childhood and an education too. Let's say you have a lawyer. That means that you don't have to do all of this alone. You see, a lawyer, they can see that bad service and they can challenge it. They can fight against that sewer service that we talked about before. They can reopen those cases that you never even knew existed. And importantly, they can show up to court so you don't have to. So you don't have to worry about missing work and risking being fired and losing your job. You don't have to worry about finding that last minute childcare. You don't have to worry about spending your last few dollars on a train ticket to the courtroom that's way across town. Lawyers can also file motions. They can negotiate a better deal with their landlord's lawyer. They can ask the court to give them more time to hear their case. And they can do this all without having to have their child under their lap. Lawyers, they can't erase hardship, but they can give you breathing room. They can argue defenses on your behalf that you didn't even know existed. They can buy you more time. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. But as we know, most poor people in civil court don't have lawyers, while the majority of their opponents do. And an interesting study in Washington, D.C. Housing Court found that just a small group of lawyers represent the vast majority of the courts. What they found was that those lawyers are able to forge personal relationships and build institutional knowledge about the courtroom, about the court staff, about the judges in a way that you can't. And they also found that that exact social capital actually leads to improved outcomes for their clients. And so this is a huge advantage for them because they know the court. They're here every day. They know the law like the back of their hand. They have the scripts. You have fear. And when you finally get into the courtroom, it's nothing like you see on TV. It is not like Law and Order. Because what happens in the courtroom is that there's no slow, careful weighing of the evidence. There's usually no jury. There's no dramatic cross-examination. Some of the hearings that I saw only lasted a few minutes. It's fast, it's technical, and it's cold. And there's also differences in the way that judges treat people who don't have lawyers, right? A judge might be frustrated by the fact that an unrepresented person doesn't understand procedure, and they might rush through the process. They might give you more time to review that document that you didn't really understand, or they might not. And this is a huge problem for people in civil court because they know that at the end of the day, the stakes are everything. They're their housing, their stability, they're their kids' neighborhood. And when the hearing ends, just like that, it's over. Some people sign stipulations that they don't understand. Others miss deadlines that they didn't know existed. The system expects you to know how to navigate the process. But if you can't afford a professional, they still expect you to keep up. And through it all, there's this hum of shame. There's a shame for not understanding. There's a shame for falling behind on them. There's a shame because the system makes you feel like it's your fault. But it's not. Because you don't lose in court because you're not smart or hardworking. You lose because the system wasn't designed to be navigated by someone like you with flexibility. And this is what it means to not have the right to an attorney. That's why cities across the country are trying to change that. For example, in New York City in 2017, they passed a right to counsel in housing court. And as a result of that law, the number of eviction filings decreased by nearly half. In cities like San Francisco and Newark, they followed suit and saw increasingly improved outcomes. There's a problem, because still a third of tenants come to court without lawyers. And how is this possible? It's because of systemic underfunding of the program. The fact that courts are deciding to move cases faster than the legal services providers can keep up. And so what I've learned from people I've spoken to, from what I've seen, from what I've read, is that this crisis isn't only about not having a lawyer with you in court. It's about the fact that the entire process, the very design of the system, quietly punishes for being being untrained in the rules, for being expected to play a game that they were never taught the rules to. So when you hear someone say, well, you have the right to an attorney, ask them, in what kind of courtroom? And ask yourself, is justice really justice if it depends on